Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Latika Bourke.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Latika Bourke. I'm writer-at-large for The Nightly in London, originally Australian, which makes me, I think, very well qualified to host this panel, and I'm very excited to introduce such a stellar cast of panellists for you. Firstly, we have Bryce Wakefield, my very good friend from Australia. He heads the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Sorry, Bryce. I know you'll forgive me. We also have, from Japan, former ambassador to Czechia, Hideo Suzuki. Martin Hála, founder and director of Sinopsis. And Renato de Castro, distinguished professor, Department of International Studies at De La Salle University, and a former advisor to the National Security Advisor. So we have such a welterweight panel to discuss some great topics. Bryce, I wanted to start with you. Firstly, could you explain the security framework in the Indo-Pacific and how it's very much not NATO?
Yeah, sure. I think you've put your finger on the point there. I mean, security works differently in our region than it does in Europe. The traditional way of explaining this, of course, is that Europe has a large multilateral security agreement where, an attack on one is an attack on all, whereas in the Indo-Pacific there are a bunch of bilateral hub and spokes arrangements. That's a bit of a simplistic way of looking at things, actually. There's many different sort of modes and modalities of security. What has happened in recent years is the arrival of minilateral arrangements, which are tightly focused on specific tasks, such as AUKUS, for example. That's perhaps the best example. It's tightly focused on delivering a submarine capability to Australia. Well, for now. So when you're in the Indo-Pacific, which we have to remember is vast and which contains many sub-regions of its own, all with their own security concerns, all with states that have different outlooks on security, you can't just think of one approach to handling the region.
Thank you, Bryce. Suzuki Taishi, Eli Ratner wrote in Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks ago that it's time to think about an Asian NATO or a defence pact of some sort. Do you think this would go down well in the region? We know that Ishiba has previously suggested this himself.
Well, I put it a little bit in other way. What we are trying to do is to build a kind of web network of security assurances and partnerships in the region. For example, we are strengthening joint exercises with partners like Philippines, and with Philippines, we have signed an agreement, a reciprocal access agreement that will facilitate these kind of joint exercises or exchange at troop levels. We are enhancing and transfer our defense technologies like radars in the Philippines again, or we are also doing grant assistance for defense equipment to different countries, not only Philippines, but also Malaysia, etc. Boats, patrol boats, radars, air control systems, these kind of things. So all these things to build trust and reinforce the alliance with the United States, to keep the U.S. engagement in this region alive.
Renato.
Hello.
If anyone except for Taiwan has been on the front line of CCP aggression, it's the Philippines. Mm-hmm. What has the Philippines done that has worked to push back against the CCP? And what does it need more of in terms of allegiances or support from its neighbours?
Well, first of all, of course, is we see the dramatic change after 6 years of appeasing China during the time of our former president who's now enjoying his vacation at The Hague. So now, of course, you have a dramatic change that you cannot simply appease China because China could never negotiate to you fairly. China will never offer concession. China's goal is simply subjugation. And we see this happening in the South China Sea and, of course, also against Taiwan. So what we've basically done, one thing is very important, is we emphasize the importance of international law, Remember, the July 12, 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling has been emphasized by this current administration, saying the fact that China's expansive claim in the South China Sea has simply no legal basis. Then, of course, we build up our military capability. We adopted for the first time the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept. And more importantly, strengthening our alliance with the United States and security partnerships with Japan, with Australia, and other European countries, Germany, France. So the important point here is most Europeans are focused on Ukraine, but the quintessential challenge, of course, will be in the region in the form of an expansive and powerful China.
Your view is somewhat of an outlier in the region. So how confident are you that you're, to the point of this topic, alone or with those people that you described?
In a way, we're an outlier in ASEAN. I have to admit
Yes.
it. Among the ASEAN countries, the Philippines is the only one taking an active role. But we're not alone. Japan is a very important ally. Certain degree, we also get support from South Korea. Then, of course, from Australia.
Trump?
Anyway, in a way, yes. Trump has saved the alliance during the time of President Rodrigo Duterte. So we don't have a very alarmist view regarding him. We have dealt with him, and the relationship was, in a way, saved the alliance. I'd emphasize this. And right now, of course, we are not as anxious as many of our European friends and allies are with the current Trump administration.
Martin, Hála, we'll come back to you, Bryce. Martin, how has the view of the CCP in Czechia changed over the last few years? And does this influence how Europe and NATO might respond to any conflict in an Indo-Pacific theatre?
Well, the view of China in the Czech Republic has changed quite dramatically over the last decade. We had a period of very pro-Beijing policies under the previous government, and especially under the previous president. We've learned our lesson the hard way, I would say. There was a number of scandals and revelations in that period, and I think that sort of inoculated the Czech society against the illusions that a lot of people still have about the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China. So I would say that the view of China in the Czech Republic has changed almost 180 degrees. So how much that's going to influence the policies of the larger bloc, right, like NATO or the EU, that remains to be seen. But I certainly do hope that the Czech experience will inform these, bigger decision-making blocs.
We have seen NATO invite these so-called IP4 leaders, Indo-Pacific 4 leaders. It's New Zealand, Australia, Japan. New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Korea. Is that achieving anything in NATO?
Is that a question for me?
That is a question to you, Martin.
No, I think it's certainly a good sign and a good first step. I would personally hope that it's going to go deeper.
To achieve what?
To achieve a more robust and more comprehensive security architecture in the Indo-Pacific. So, NATO has been immensely successful in the Euro-Atlantic. I think there's no doubt about it. And I think the difference in the Indo-Pacific is that you have many of these bilaterals and minilaterals, but there isn't this overarching entity like NATO, and that leaves a void. And then wherever there's a void, there will be other forces pushing in.
Do you agree with that, Bryce? Yes, Ambassador, you first.
Yeah, I think the IP4 is very much succeeding in a way that it builds confidence between Europeans and the Japanese and Australians and the players in the Pacific. With NATO, Japan has renewed, I think 2 years ago, the program of a whole set of cooperation, and all these are being implemented. We have newcomers in the Pacific, European newcomers like Italians. Last year and 2 years before, the Italian Air Force came to Japan in Komatsu to do a joint exercise with us. So I think this is a gateway for NATO and NATO partners into the Pacific, and this is succeeding.
I mean, this is a big question about how much hard power Europe sends to the region at a time when it's increasingly stressed in its own theatre. Bryce Wakefield, do you see this equation working in any way, and should it be encouraged to continue?
Look, I don't think there's any great demand, and we understand that there are existential security problems in Europe at the moment. I don't think there's much demand from Indo-Pacific nations that Europe sends hard power or expectation, frankly. What the IP4 is really good at doing is focusing on things like misinformation and disinformation, focusing on things like cyber attacks, countering those sort of things that do not change the balance of power in a material sense, but in an ideational sense, right? And there are other things that that IP4, whether it's in that context or that just those nations can do. For example, countering China's attempts to take over leadership roles in organizations like the United Nations, right? There's a whole lot that these countries that can be doing that's not the sort of hard military aspects of security. Just on the point of how we view the Trump administration, which was mentioned previously, I think we in the region are a little bit more sanguine about the Trump administration than you guys in Europe are, and that's for a very good reason. We've been let down by America quite a lot, actually, right? So America's presence in the Indo-Pacific hasn't always been as committed as it has been to NATO. We saw that with the Nixon shocks in the 1970s. We've seen that in America's, the Obama administration's pivot to Asia that sort of went nowhere. Joe Biden's policy towards Southeast Asia was anemic. He would, not turn up to meetings and stuff like that. So we're sort of more at ease, I think. Obviously, Trump is not business as usual, but we're more at ease with the notion of an unreliable America than I think Europe is.
Interesting thoughts. Okay, we're going to move to some questions around Taiwan, and if you would like to contribute a question, please do that on Slido. We will have some microphones at the end of this to get you to ask some questions. But I have a poll for you that I prepared about how the EU should respond to any Chinese military aggression against Taiwan, and I would love to see your views on these questions. Of course, they're very blanket, but a little gauge on that would be interesting. Does the panel agree with Pete Hegseth's warning at Shangri-La that an attack on Taiwan is imminent? Renato?
I'm based in Taiwan right now. I see the preparation being made by the Taiwanese. Just go to a building, I'm staying in a building, and you see the sign, air raid shelter. It reminds me of the London Blitz way back in the 1940s.
I have seen these air raid shelters.
Yes, yeah.
I've heard a lot of them don't actually lead to anywhere, though.
And they have resumed the services of the reserve. You're already a reserve officer, you serve in the active, but then you're being recalled. Plus, of course, the acquisition. And more so, of course, is the preparation being made by U.S. Indo-PACOM. And we're part of it because we're so close to Taiwan. We are a U.S. treaty ally. If you're familiar with what happened, we just had the major Balikatan exercise where the situation was full battle simulation. We got it. Basically, we got the message. We see how the Chinese are behaving, not only in the South China Sea, more so along Taiwan. And of course, how Admiral Paparo described, the Chinese naval exercise is a rehearsal for the actual invasion of Taiwan by 2027. This is what we call the notion of the Davidson window. It's basically this is an assessment of the U.S. Indo-PACOM in Hawaii.
So you agree?
I cannot discount the fact that the largest U.S. unified command would basically have that assessment.
And do you think, from what you see in Taiwan, that the Taiwanese are ready?
They're ready, but of course, that's also the problem when we talk about if war would happen. Just like what happened in Ukraine, up to the last moment, members of the Ukrainian parliament refused to believe that Russia would invade them. Because we always want to think that the worst case situation would not happen. But of course, they do happen. Look at what happened, February 2022. So I think that's human nature. We try to deny something that is negative, but at the end of the day, of course, if this would happen, Murphy's Law. If something bad will happen, it would happen.
Bryce, what would Australia do?
It would depend on the response of the United States.
And would it depend on the person in the White House?
No, I don't think so. No, look, Australia is a committed ally to the United States, the fundamental basis of its security, right? There is debate in Australia about whether we should respond in a contingency on Taiwan, but I don't find that debate. I don't find the negative voices credible. I think that Australia relies so heavily on its alliance with the US that it would be very, very hard pressed not to join some sort of conflict, not to support the United States in some fashion if there was a conflict. It would do so in a way that prioritised, of course, Australia's interests, and the interests that Australia would have would be first and foremost to defend its trade routes, and that includes routes in the Indian Ocean. And it would probably, assuming it had a submarine capability, would patrol the reach of the straits through which Chinese submarines could break out of the South China Sea.
I mean, interesting, we have seen any Australian involvement over Taiwan being laid down as a condition, almost, of AUKUS. This is one of the reasons that Elbridge Colby has previously cited, who is now overseeing a review into whether actually AUKUS should go ahead. So I do think there is a bit more of an expectation that Australia would have to join in that conflict.
Yeah, but they can't say so publicly. I mean, it's a statement that they can't actually enforce. You can't.
So that's a bad tactic from the United States, then.
Well, they haven't actually said that will need to happen. I mean, I think you actually asked Colby the question about a year ago, and he did say, this is something that we can't actually formally ask of Australia, but everybody knows what the situation is anyway, right? Mm.
Ambassador, is Japan ready for any conflict over Taiwan? And is the expectation that the United States is still the reliable ally?
Well, I don't want to be too much overly alarming, or to answer any kind of hypothetical question. But I think that we will be acting accordingly to the situation.
Which means what?
The way that happens, and in which way. And anyway, I think that to answer that question on the screen, what we ask to the Europeans in that kind of situation is, first and foremost, the political support against unilateral use of force, and stay united against unilateral attempt to change the status quo. That's most important. And if anything happens, whether we take economic sanctions, again, it depends on the situation. Military assistance, I think it'd be very important that the Europeans participate in the kind of supply chain of assets or munitions, etc., if, in case an armed conflict occurs, and of course, in case.
I mean, we're talking about this as a foregone conclusion already, and I don't think that's appropriate, maybe. I mean, there is deterrence. We are deterring against a Taiwan situation, but the Taiwan situation, it kind of poses a dilemma for China on its own, without the participation of allies, because an attack on Taiwan would be so destructive to the global economy, given its centrality to supply chains, particularly in critical technologies, that the Chinese would essentially be kicking themselves in the teeth, right? Their legitimacy, the legitimacy of the PRC, relies on the economic well-being of the people of China, and if that's disturbed because of an action of the Chinese government, then they lose legitimacy. They may fall from power. So I think we've got a long way to go before we believe that a contingency over Taiwan
do you accept the 27? the 27 timeframe that President Xi has said, now that could be just
sure.
rousing, jingoistic rousing.
Sure.
But Hegseth, in his language at Shangri-La, was a lot stronger than previous warnings have been. from the US.
So look, they are aiming to be ready by 2027. That doesn't mean that they're going to do it, right? And we get tied up in what will happen in a contingency over Taiwan, and of course we should plan for it. But it's going to be such an incredibly, well, I don't want to say it's going to be, it would be such a complex and multifaceted situation that to a certain extent, discussion of it is hypothetical. I am of the camp, and I think you know this, Latika, that I don't actually think it's likely, right? Because of the factors that I've just pointed out. I think it would be so destructive for China that they are going to greatly pause. And one of the reasons I don't think it's likely is because they see a possible political situation that's dependent on Taiwanese democracy. Taiwan has, in its democratic firmament, the KMT, a party that openly advocates for better relations with China. When I was working in Washington on this, 15 years ago or so, the KMT was in power, and people were openly talking about how it was inevitable that Taiwan would simply integrate into China at some stage. I think the Chinese Communist Party probably believes that at some stage there will be a return of the KMT and they can negotiate rather than...
that would be the easiest solution.
Yeah.
Martin, is the picture in Europe suddenly so much more difficult because you have trying to diversify yourself away from Russian gas and dependency? At the same time, you've had the post-COVID response of trying to diversify supply lines and dependencies, China there. And then in the White House, you have enormous tariffs coming your way. Where on earth do you land in that picture? And does that give China a bit of an easier ride than it might otherwise have had?
It is a difficult situation, and we're probably not going to land in a very nice place, under all these circumstances. But maybe let me go one step back to that question about the possible aggression from China against Taiwan. I would slightly disagree in the sense that the Chinese leadership, the leadership of the Communist Party of China, they have their own logic, they have their own way of looking at things, and that's often quite different from our logic. So I'm afraid that they are willing to pay a cost that might not be acceptable to people in democratic societies. I'm afraid that the Chinese leadership and even specifically Secretary General Xi Jinping are personally invested in the goal of quote-unquote reunification. And
we have an aging leader in Xi Jinping. His own window is closing, right?
That's right, and he sees his legacy in this whole thing. And given the political system in China, which is run top-down, obviously it's a Leninist system, the tolerance for pain is much bigger than in many other societies. So I'm afraid that they, when you look at it from within their own logic, they have all the reasons to go in. So it's just a matter of the ultimate cost and the deterrence. So I think by the time some kind of a confrontation occurs, it's already too late. So I think deterrence is crucial. It's of immense importance, and I also worry that the current level of deterrence may not be enough to actually stop the Communist Party of China from taking action sooner or later.
And just on the picture with the United States, does that give China the easier pass from Europe?
I wouldn't say so, but it certainly does affect the thinking in Europe, and not in a positive way. Again, I think it's not just about hard power, right? It's not about counting tanks and aircraft carriers. There are also the software parts to the power balance. And for generations, a big part of the U.S. Global power projection were the alliances. And the alliances have been shaken, and in my mind, that actually decreases the overall power of not just the United States, but let's say, the free world.
Ambassador, I can see you nodding in agreement there. Do you think there has been lasting damage from the White House on these alliances?
Well, on that point, I would rather agree with our Filipino friend. I think there was there are a lot of statements coming from the White House. But I think we take it more as kind of wake-up calls and etc. You know, the geopolitical situation in the Indo-Pacific has changed dramatically.
Yes.
We would traditionally sea power, and we thought that surrounded by sea means protection. We felt safe, but not anymore. Missiles and drones don't care about whether it's land or water that it flies over. So we have to react more quickly and more effectively to this kind of imminent threats and aggression. That's why we are fortifying our capabilities for striking back, the standoff capabilities, etc., etc. So that means a lot of resources, infrastructure investments, and I think this is further enhanced and in collaboration with the United States. I don't really think that there is any kind of malentendu between Japan and United States current administration.
And how is the mood in the Japanese population about these questions? We had very strong leadership on these issues from Abe and Kishida. Mm-hmm. Is this going to continue on that trajectory?
I think so. I think so. We had decided 2-3 years ago that we will double defense expenditure, and the rate of increase of defense expenditure is #1 in Japan among the G7 countries. So we are really doing a lot of efforts, and this may result in more burden for the taxpayers, but I think there is a larger support for that.
Let's have a look at the poll results. Some very, very strong answers here, actually. We're going to bring them up for you. Yes, here we are. 59% think there should be a military role for the EU. That's quite surprising to me. Renato, what would that look like?
That's important, the fact that Europe should contribute in terms of military and, more importantly, economic sanction. But at this point in time, the most important contribution of the EU is to prevent Russia from winning in Ukraine, against Ukraine.
Yeah.
Because the two are actually linked. China is watching what's happening at Ukraine. If Russia would win in Ukraine, then China would say, if this would work against Ukraine, I could apply it against Taiwan. So my point here is that the security of the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic is cannot be divided. It's indivisible. Because we are both faced by what I call the Eurasian alignment. It's not yet an alliance similar to the Cold War during the Sino-Soviet alliance then. This is an alignment. So this is something we face.
And yet we hear different views inside the Trump administration on this. We have one camp, again, the Elbridge-Colby camp, saying, Europe, focus on Russia. We've got the Indo-Pacific over here, thanks, we'll deal with it. Is that the wrong approach?
This is something what I call prioritization on the part of the United States. It's actually an admission of the recognition of the limits of American power. Mm-hmm. The fact that they could not, unlike during the Cold War, I could still remember this, growing up the Cold War, they could fight the two-front war. The Reagan administration focused in Europe, then in the Pacific you have the horizontal escalation. At this point in time, because of the United States involvement for almost a decade in a war against terror, the US military has basically lost its capability to fight the two-front war, plus of course looking at what happened to American industry, specifically shipbuilding industry. The Indo-Pacific region is a maritime region. It's not simply the matter of ships you have, it's your shipbuilding capacity. And the United States Navy and the Pentagon and up to the White House is very much aware, China now has the largest Navy in the world. I was in a conference in Singapore. You have a Chinese war warrior diplomat who said to the audience, China now has the largest navy in the world. It's not just a number of ships. The capability of the Chinese shipbuilding industry to rebuild the Chinese navy, similar to what the U.S. industry did during the Battle of the Atlantic. Remember this?
Plus the merchant shipping that they
the
have.
Capacity to build those Liberty ships that continue to convoy it and basically enable the Western allies to launch the Operation Overlord. It's because, but the United States simply does not have that capability right now.
Martin, Renato talked there about the United States no longer having the capacity to fight a two-front war, but is it a bit more than that? Has this United States lost its appetite to fight against Russia or to contribute to that fight against Russia?
I think that's a good way to put it. Maybe they didn't lose the ability; they just lost the appetite. But in any case, like I said, I think it's more. It's about more than just hard power. The equation is much more complicated, much more complex, especially given the revolution in military tactics and strategy. Right? We see that in the Ukraine, that the situation in the battlefield. The calculation of military power is actually changing quite fast. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing, and I would say that the two theaters, Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, are connected at the hip, just like Renato said. So I actually do understand why people would vote in the poll here the way they voted, because I think they're. Just picture the situation. If there's an attack on Taiwan, especially in the situation of an ongoing war in the Ukraine, it would probably escalate into a global conflict pretty fast.
So those theaters would merge.
Exactly, those theaters, and they're already merging in a way. Like there are North Koreans fighting in the Ukraine. So the two regions are already merged essentially.
So, but just to finish on that point, does that mean that the message is, as Renato said, it's very clear for Europe what to do on China, but it's also very important for the Trump administration to understand what it has to do on Ukraine, isn't it?
You would think, right? But I'm afraid that they actually look at these things differently.
Ambassador, I could see you raising your hand there.
You're asking us, does America has any appetite? It's up to us. Make them hungry, Still, the Chinese Navy may be very maybe formidable now with the 3 aircraft carriers, but still, the American assets, defense assets, is a formidable one, by far the number one. And its force of organizing alliance and the partnership is far beyond China.
And China has not yet been tested on these things.
So let's make it function, and it's up to us to make it function.
I think that's important. I mean, I think there's a role here for Indo-Pacific actors to actually say to the United States, look, Europe is important, and the best way that Europe can help us in the Indo-Pacific is as Renato said, to win the war on Ukraine. But we should be telling the Americans that, because the problem, I think, is not that Europe hasn't got the message that it needs to stand up. The problem is that it doesn't have time.
Yes.
Right? So we need to say to the Trump administration, we accept that we are now more important and that you're going to focus on us, but slowly, please, right? Not as fast as you're going at the moment in terms of withdrawing your support for Ukraine.
Can I just react to Ambassador Suzuki's point? I agree with him that at this point in time, we still have, of course, the capable U.S. But you have also to look in terms of, again, we go back to the Cold War. I still remember, when we were both confronting the Soviet Union. I could still remember this. The Soviet Union has a first world military capability, but had a third world economy. China is different. China now is developing a first world economy, a military, but has a first world economy. So the United States form of war is basically, I have the industrial capability to basically overwhelm you, but this will not be the case, just in case if a conflict would happen. The United States would really confront the quintessential pure competitor. It still has the same industrial base, shipbuilding capacity. That war would be protracted. China has a capacity to fight a modern industrial war simply because, unlike the Soviet Union, it has a huge economy, modern economy, and China, of course, cannot anymore be contained.
And Renato, this is the point you make. It's why I actually don't like this Cold War 2.0 association, because it's a completely different type of conflict that we're facing and threat picture.
Quoting Karl Marx, first one is a tragedy, the second one is a farce. Which will be the tragedy now?
Let's go to Slido. There's some very good questions coming in, so please do contribute your questions. I think this is a great panel. What could force China to change its long-term imperialistic behaviour in the region in the short and long term? I think this is one of the biggest unasked questions. Is there any way that China will change its mind under President Xi? And then what comes next? Is there any hope there? Can we effectively deter for as long as he is alive with the hope that things then change? Martin?
Well, I think the assertiveness or aggressivity of the People's Republic of China at this moment is just a function of the political system. So and especially under Xi Jinping, but I think it actually precedes Xi Jinping. The discourse has been decided even before Xi Jinping. So I'm afraid that nothing short of a political change in China would probably change the situation much.
Mm. Is that the view of the rest of the panel?
Yeah.
Can see some nods. Bryce, you're a little...
Well, I mean, Martin did make the point that this is a Leninist state that is very much kind of dependent on its leadership for policy formation. So, what would force China, what would make China change its long-term imperialistic behaviour? Perhaps a change in the leadership.
Yeah, that's right.
Or continued effective deterrence, right?
Yeah.
Or Russia's defeat in Ukraine, which basically would make any Chinese leadership think twice that it could basically conduct an expansionist adventure.
But there is a counter to this, because Putin has clearly gotten himself into a war that he couldn't resolve in the first week. Mm-hmm. So isn't there also this counter-argument that President Xi watches this and says, oh gosh, you miscalculated there?
Yeah, of course there's also an argument, China is also trying to learn the mistakes of Russia, that you simply prepared for a 3-day military operation. Mm. That's why the Chinese are really making it a point. What basically convinced Indo-PACOM to think that China would really go for 2027, it eventually came out the Washington Post. They saw, again, going back to what happened just before Operation Overlord, 2 Mulberry-type ports being built in Xiamen. You won't invest that much money to build a Mulberry style. The one that was used by the British and the Americans after D-Day, being built in Xiamen. So again, this is a point here. China is also watching the mistakes of Putin. But I think, basically my personal view is, if Putin would suffer a terrible bloody nose in Ukraine, this will at least make Xi Jinping think twice. If he could do it against Taiwan, because again, Taiwan is more complicated. Taiwan would involve a maritime amphibious operation. D-Day was successful because the Allied controlled the sea, but China would still have to slug it out with the 7th Fleet, and of course, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force.
Is Vladimir Putin the only leader that Xi Jinping is watching making mistakes? What about Donald Trump?
Well, that's the advantage of being a superpower and having allies. You can afford to make mistakes every now and then.
You're a lot more optimistic
and that's usually a case of war. Wars are not won by brilliant strategy. War are won because the other side made a worse mistake than you did.
There's some grins here on the panel. Do any of you want to jump in here? We're just happy to laugh in solidarity. Okay, let's go to another question. I do like this one. What is your view on the EU security and defence partnerships with Japan, South Korea, perhaps India, and there's one that's being offered to Australia right now. And in fact, when this was offered by Ursula von der Leyen to our Prime Minister, Bryce Wakefield, the Prime Minister seemed to have no clue what it was and confused it with the IP4 of NATO. Do these defence agreements have any real potential and liftoff, or is it more vague talk from the European Union?
Yeah, so as you said, when Albanese was offered the prospect of a strategic partnership with the EU, I think his response was, thank you, that looks like an interesting idea, see you. And I think Australia's problem there is that we have really been focused on building architecture around the region that has real purpose and real specific purpose. I've mentioned AUKUS already. The Quad is another example of that.
And the Squad.
Yeah,
to bring in the Philippines.
and what we are a little bit skeptical about is the notion of partnership for partnership's sake. There should be a discussion, and it could be led initially by private organizations in a sort of track 2, track 1.5 format to figure out where it is that Europe and Australia or other partners in the region can cooperate to lead to specific outcomes. What we don't want is labeling that looks like a press release. We've got strategic partnerships with everybody. China has a bunch of strategic partnerships. We have a strategic partnership with China. China has a strategic partnership.
We also have a free trade agreement with China, which they didn't seem to worry about during COVID, but anyway.
China has a strategic partnership with Ukraine. I mean, you know, we want some meat on the bones of these arrangements. We don't just want sort of strategic signaling from parties like the EU. And we certainly don't want, I think, countries to join bandwagons. There was a suggestion at our national conference, Latika, you were there, by the former Prime Minister of Japan, Taro Aso, that there should be a JAUKUS, right? And no one really knew what that meant. It was just adding another letter to the label type of thing. There certainly are opportunities within AUKUS for other countries to join, but they have to be tightly focused on, laser-like focused on specific tasks within those arrangements, not just joining for joining's sake.
Ambassador, Japan has signed one of these defence and security partnerships with Europe. Is that going to lead to anything meaningful?
Yes, I think, well, if you're talking about military cooperation as such, I think EU has to have some kind of structure like NATO. But anyway, look at the sanctions against Russia or support to Ukraine. We are coordinating very, very closely with the European Union through G7 or bilaterally. Mm-hmm. So, well, security and defense partnership is growing, that's for sure.
Yeah, the G7 is a very important role for Japan, I think.
Yes,
It brings Indo-Pacific.
It's a kind of link between the Atlantic Alliance and the Indo-Pacific. So we always very big importance on having G7. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to some more questions on Slido. These are great questions. Thank you for submitting them, and please do continue. So if defence exports to Taiwan are not approved for fear of upsetting the CCP, how can the EU and UK be taken seriously when we discuss deterrence? Martin, I think that might be a question for you.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't decide these things, but obviously, you know, there is a problem of credibility. So, again, you know, I think the deterrence is crucially important here, and it has to be credible. So every detail matters, including the approvals for sharing military material with Taiwan. So in my mind, it's a no-brainer, but like I said, you know, it's not for me to decide.
Okay, I think we might finish with the view of the panel on where we started. And this question, I think, really addresses it, and it's had lots of upvotes. With the exception of Israel, has the US not spent the last 2 decades, I think you had it a bit longer even, Bryce, showing us that it's an increasingly unreliable ally? After all that we've heard, do we say yes or no? Is the US unreliable when it really comes to it? Do we think they will show up for us? Renato?
Well, we have to understand the very essence of alliance. Alliances are not friendship. Alliances are driven by moral values. Allies will provide you assistance if it's an interest to do so.
Yep.
Not because it is a commitment to you or friends. So we have to understand the very essence of alliance. Alliances are utilitarian relationship. If you know the U.S. would honor its treaty commitment, it will be based not on its legal obligation, but it's a matter of its interests. Remember what Edward Grey said just before the First World War regarding Britain's commitment to Belgium. It will be driven by our interests, not the other way around. So we have to understand first the very essence of alliance before we put a moral judgment on the United States' behavior.
Ambassador?
Yeah, my answer is no. I mean, the USA alliance is reliable. But as far as we make our part, I mean, if we take the responsibility to make it reliable, it's going to be reliable. And that's why we are doing such things as I told you at the beginning, rallying the partners in the region to make it more comfortable for US to really commit in the region and to make them understand that they are not alone.
Bryce, in Australia we have tariffs on us, okay, smaller than those against China and European Union. We have a review into AUKUS. Maybe not unreliable, but are they erratic?
No, look, as has already been mentioned, the United States will act upon its interests, right? And it's increasingly seeing our region as more connected to its interests than elsewhere. That's not always been the case, and then, as I've said, it's driven a kind of approach to the region where they haven't been as committed as we think they should be sometimes. But that's based on how they view the international world, and we've got to help them see it our way, if you like, right? We've got to talk to them about what's important in our region, what they should react to, and shape the view of their interests, because interests are not completely objective, of course. We've seen this with the Trump administration. They do differ depending on who they are. But the basic fact is, we're talking here about America first. America has always put itself first, right? That's what great powers do, right?
But not always at the expense of a world order that has protected it, that it helped build. I think that is the difference.
Well, never, because of course, since it's been a great power, it's existed in that world order. So yeah, sure, but it's a simple calculation of what they see as important, and we got to help them see the things that we see as important. We got to make our interests their interests in a way.
Martin, final word.
Just a very short comment. It's, I don't even think about it in terms of reliability. What really worries me about the United States is their change in the whole strategic outlook. They define their own interests differently now, and that has an impact on the whole world, and that's where the problem is for me.
And on that cheery note, it's time to end this panel. Thank you very much to this wonderful cast of panellists. That was a very thorough and great discussion. And we now have a 5-minute coffee break. Thank you very much for attending.